Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, depending on where you're joining us from right now. Welcome to Say It with Science, the Nexus of Food and Climate. My name is Ariel Jim-Ross. I am a Vice News correspondent. I'm also the host of a weekly podcast called Vice News Reports. That's a general news podcast. But for 3 years, I was the climate change correspondent for Vice News Tonight on HBO. And climate change is still a topic that is very near and close to my heart. So I'll be moderating today's discussion with climate experts, food experts, and we're going to dive into the latest science, policy, and solutions around the issue of global food systems. By the end of this hour, my hope is that you will get a better understanding of just how food and climate change are interconnected. It's not just that climate change is threatening agriculture and food security, but it's also how everything from the way we produce and package to deliver and consume food exacerbates the climate crisis as well. So before we start our panel, I'd like to introduce a very special video message from the Philippines. This video was created by a local fisher leader and poverty activist named Roberto Allerosa. And this was created just for us in the last few days. And in the video, Roberto is going to share his personal story of how climate change has impacted fishing and indigenous food traditions for his community.
I am Roberto Allerosa. They call me Ka-Over. No? I am a fisher fox living in the coastal town of Calatagan in the province of Batangas in the Philippines. I have been fishing to provide food for my family since I can remember because I have 6 children, and I am very proud that I was able to provide them for their education that I was not able to enjoy because of poverty. I remember that in the last, I think 30 to 35 years, we can still catch around 20 kilos a day. However, during this time, we are lucky to be able to catch 2 kilos a day na lang only. And there is time that we catch nothing at all. That's the real situation that we are suffering. We can say that this is because the problems on illegal fishing and destruction of marine habitats like mangroves and the coral reefs. Lately, we have observed that our coral reefs in Calatagan are experiencing coral bleaching, which we attribute to increased sea temperature. Just last year, we are all over the news about the massive coral bleaching in the province of Batangas. Coral bleaching has direct impact that lead to our decreased fish catch. The Philippines is also prone to extreme weather events such as strong typhoons. We are worried that because of the increasing intensity and frequency of typhoons, further destructions of homes and our properties are expected since most of our fisher folk are living near the shore. In order to improve our fish catch and income from fishing, we are proposing for our government to improve fisheries management, to include rehabilitation of our degraded marine habitats such as mangroves and coral reefs. We are working with the government to see to it that abandoned, undeveloped, and underutilized fish ponds are reverted back to mangrove in order to improve our protection from strong winds in waves from super typhoons. We are also working with the government to provide safe peace settlement away from the dangers of displacement due to the extreme weather conditions. I am 68 years old by next month, October. But I'm still hopeful that we will be able to achieve sustainable fisheries in the country that is resilient from any disruptions caused by changing climates and perennial problems of illegal fishing and overfishing. I am hopeful that through fishing, we can still provide food for our families for their basic needs such as education, food, and shelter. I am Roberto Allerosa. I am a fisher folk from the Philippines.
Thank you so much, Roberto, for that message and for sharing your story. It's a reminder that climate change is a human experience, and that gives us a lot to think about as we head into our next discussion. So let's dive in. Joining us today, we have Dr. Agnes Kalibata, the UN Special Envoy on the Food Systems Summit. We also have Dr. Rachel Besner-Kerr, Global Development Professor at Cornell University, and Connor Spacey, Chef and Culinary Director at Food Space Ireland. So let's start right at the beginning, the science and the impact. Dr. Kalibata, can you give us a high-level overview of the connection between food and climate? What does the latest science tell us about how climate is impacting food, and likewise, how our food systems are exacerbating the climate crisis?
Thank you so much. Let me just start by saying that we depend on climate for food. We need climate to function for us to be able to have the different types of food that we have enjoyed for decades. So what has happened in the last few years since climate changed and started being a serious menace to producers, we don't produce enough anymore. So let me just paint the picture for you. In 2015, when we signed the SDGs and committed to come through on ending hunger, it's actually the very year that hunger started increasing. If you're on the equator, the frequency of droughts since 2012 just went out of control. If you look at things today, for every 3 seasons, 1 season is failed for farmers that live in food systems. So that is very challenging. It's increasing poverty. It's eroding the ability to understand and know what is going on from a climate perspective. And it's eroding the ability of communities to be able to put nutritious food on the table. But from a biodiversity perspective, let's also look at the fact that the rate of loss of biodiversity is exacerbated by climate change itself. So the problem is big. But more importantly, for all these communities, like we just heard from this gentleman from the Philippines, the ability to be able to feed their families, the ability, or even the thought that they might get out of poverty using the means of production available to them is not going to be possible unless we fix the challenge of climate change. On the other hand, food systems are impacting climate change. We are contributing 30% to climate change. We are eroding biodiversity at a rate of 80%. So it's really a chicken and egg, but for me, I really think that this is a code red, like it has been indicated in the most recent IPCC. We don't have a choice. So the opportunity of this Food Systems Summit was really to bring this conversation to everybody, to help people understand that our planet depends on the choices we make every day, and the choices we make in food are contributing 30% to destroying our planet.
Thank you so much for that. Dr. Besner-Kerr, we know that the science in the latest IPCC report indicates that, a hotter future is certain. But, with that in mind, what keeps you up at night when you're thinking about food systems and food security? And how long do we have to reverse some of the remaining uncertainty?
Thank you so much, Ariel, and I am privileged to be part of this panel. And I think the question of what keeps me up at night, for the last 3 years, I've had the privilege of working alongside climate scientists and other scientists from around the world on the IPCC Working Group 2 report, which is due to be coming out next year. And what we've studied and learned about in our assessment definitely keeps me up at night because we're looking at impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation solutions. But in many ways, what also keeps me up at night is the thinking about the ways in which, because I came to the IPCC and I'm here speaking as an independent scientist, not on behalf of the IPCC, because our report isn't yet released until next year. But I came with long experience, over 2 decades of experience working with smallholder farmers in Malawi and Tanzania on participatory research, doing research on ways to improve their food security and nutrition. And what keeps me up at night as well is the ways in which our food system is already broken and is really contributing to the problem at hand. So Dr. Kalibata mentioned that about 1/3 of the greenhouse gases come from the food system. And part of that is how we produce food. So we grow food globally, largely like a factory. It's often called industrial food systems because it's an input-output model where you have synthetic fertilizer, pesticides, mechanization, seeds that use a lot of fossil fuels in order to produce them, in order to distribute them, in order to apply them. And the kinds of foods that we also consume also produce a lot of greenhouse gases. So we're eating more red meat and dairy than is good for our health, and it's contributing a lot to greenhouse gases. But that's only part of the problem that keeps me up at night, because it's not just how we're producing food, but who holds the power within the food system that is part of the problem. Because it's only a very few companies that produce the seeds, the fertilizer, the pesticides. It's a highly concentrated industry of only a few very large companies, which gives them a lot of power over the food system. It's a highly undemocratic food system. And at the same time, on the retail side, we have a very few number of companies that are selling products which themselves are making us sick. So in high-income countries, over 80% of the disease burden lies with non-communicable diseases like diabetes and chronic heart disease, which are caused in part by unhealthy foods that we're eating. And we're not producing enough of the diverse fruits and vegetables and whole grains that we need to stay healthy. And part of the issue is not looking for the solutions with marginalized voices who are most affected by climate change. So those smallholder farmers hold a lot of the solutions for addressing climate change, but they themselves are most impacted. And Dr. Kalibata described, very eloquently how droughts, floods, extreme events are already impacting people in Malawi, in India, around the world who are least equipped to be able to deal with that. So those two sides of the equation really do keep me up at night. And it comes down in a way to a deeply unequal food system, which is contributing to the problem and exacerbating climate change impacts for all of us, but particularly for marginalized people.
So I'm really interested in the idea of trying to make the power within the food system more diffuse. And actually, I think this is a perfect segue into Chef Spacey. When you look at the food industry and the way that we produce food at large, can you tell us, a bit about how we got here? And if you don't mind me asking, from your perspective, right, being so deeply involved in food, how do we make that power more diffuse? How do we ensure that marginalized communities are part of the conversation?
Yeah, great question. And thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here today as well. And I think you're right. I think for us to understand why our food system is the way it is and how broken it is, we need to understand why or how we got here. And if we think back, and it's not that long ago, if we go back to the 1800s, when we were a much smaller population on the planet, when we were just at 1 billion people, we struggled to feed people at that time. And if you think about it, most countries on the planet then were affected one way or another around food. Ireland ourselves had a famine during the 1840s, and a lot of countries were affected around the food system. So what had happened was food needed to be grown more, it needed to be grown quicker and faster, and I suppose in some ways they needed to feed 1 billion people better was the plan at that time. And very like Dr. Besner-Kerr just mentioned, it's that system fast forward to today is where the problems lie. It's that system that was initially set up to actually help the planet is the same system that is now not helping the planet. In fact, it's gone the total opposite. And we need to learn from that to be able to move forward. And for me, from a chef, I think I was never comfortable. I'm chef over 30 years, and I've never been comfortable seeing our food system firsthand. And what I mean by firsthand is seeing how we buy our food, how we treat our food, and how we sell our food onto our consumers. The food we waste, the food that travels literally over the planet when it doesn't have to travel over the planet. And it's something that really, I don't know how to describe it. It's something I've never been comfortable with, and I've always been determined to try and see how we make it better. How do we change a food system? And I learn as I go along. For me, a lot of my answers were to look at local food and seasonal food. And yes, that's really, really important. But geographically, that all depends on where we are on the planet. And also, as a food system, food will and always will have to travel. You know, we are part of a global food system. So it's, to me, it was more about trying to reconnect people to food. And that to me is where we understand the science behind where we are and where our planet is. And a lot of it is around education to reconnect people on the planet, not just here in my country or your country, globally reconnect to food and to understand the problems before we understand how we can come together to fix it, if that makes sense.
Thank you so much for that, Chef Spacey. Yes, please, by all means.
No, thank you. So it's really great to be on the same panel with you, Rachel, and Spacey. So I want to first of all say one way of engaging communities. Really, we had a food system summit, and in this summit, what we did was really to try to reach out to millions of people, hundreds of people, to just make sure that we are hearing their voices as well. But let's go back to the question the point you raised, Rachel, around inequity in food systems. And it's true, we have huge inequity, but the power point that you're talking about, when I look at what I see in Africa here today, it's not that, it's a very different perspective from what you're describing. The whole centralization of things in corporates in a few hands, we don't have that as much, right? Even as we know that being able to get seed, you have to get it from some SME somewhere. So for me, the question is, when we call out all these challenges, what are the solutions to these challenges? How do we contextualize the fact that our food system are so complex and so different? On one hand, you have dairy and livestock and big ag as one problem. On another hand, you have people that are in the very systems we are describing here, living suboptimally. Spacey just talked about it, living suboptimally. The very food systems that we used to live, where there was much more redistribution of the choice on food, they're not. These people don't have a life. They live in poverty. So what is the middle ground for these things?
Yeah, I'm so glad you asked that question because, in fact, in my experience working for over 2 decades in Malawi, there is a highly concentrated seed and fertilizer industry also in Malawi. Very few large foreign multinational corporations are the same companies operating there. But to me, the solution lies in part with an approach which I've been using with my fellow researchers in Malawi, farmers, agroecology. And agroecology is in contrast to an industrial model. It's a holistic approach to growing food, which uses principles like increasing biodiversity. You mentioned the low biodiversity that we have right now, and it's an emergency in and of itself. Building synergies between different parts of the system, reducing the use of dependence on external inputs, and recycling organic matter back into the soil, recycling energy, but also importantly, drawing on indigenous and local knowledge. And so this means co-producing scientific knowledge with farmers. And this is a really important dimension of agroecology, which is in contrast to the industrial model. And Chef Spacey mentioned it, rebuilding connections between producers and consumers to try to strengthen local and regional markets. Yes, some of our food will be global, but a lot of it can be produced locally. And ensuring equity in the food system through addressing questions of inequity in the governance of global food systems. So this is a really sort of core to the work that we've been doing. And in our results, and we've published numerous publications showing that taking this approach has improved food security, it's improved nutrition, including children and women, and livelihoods for smallholder farmers, while also strengthening the environmental services that we get from land, water, and soil. So this is the approach that I think is really an important part of the solution to fixing our broken food system. But I want to come back to something that Chef Spacey mentioned, which I think is important too, and that you mentioned as well at the beginning, Dr. Kalibata. You mentioned that we don't have enough food. In fact, we produce more than 3 times the amount that is needed to feed our global human population, but it's a problem of distribution and the kinds of food that we're producing. And when the Irish famine, you mentioned the Irish famine, Chef Spacey, I mean, that famine wasn't due to, it was in a large part to do with colonialism. And colonialism and imperialism are a big part of how we got to where we are today, and shaped our global food system in really profound ways and set up an international trade system that really put a lot of countries at a major disadvantage. So there were major famines experienced in the late 1800s in India, in China, and that famine was produced through colonial relations because the British were imposing production of food or products for export rather than local food for local communities. And some of those unequal power relations, I'm not picking on Britain, but because you mentioned Ireland, all of the Western European countries were involved in the game, but some of those colonial and post-colonial relations reverberate in the contemporary period. So we see low-income countries, there's a pattern that is due to this long history of colonialism and imperialism. So it's not, again, power is really at the heart of the solution because it's part of what led to the problem in the first place. I could go on, but let me give you a chance to speak, and maybe Ariella wants to get in another question.
Well, yeah, actually, I was going to say, one of the things that I hear you talking about is about going back to far more sustainable ways of farming, things like maybe carbon farming, mixing things, different plants, not just doing monoculture, those kinds of things. And from what I understand, Chef Spacey, you have been working on sustainable farming. Is that correct?
Yeah, so I suppose the ethos around food space here in Ireland, we're a catering company. We have over 20 cafes across Ireland, the island of Ireland. But we really, I suppose the best way to describe it is dive deep into our own local food system and how I look at it that as a company, we have a huge responsibility to where and how we spend our money. So we work off what we call a 50-mile menu, so that each of our kitchens work within their own localities. And it's not about, I buy food from a guy because he sells it and that food might have been imported from across the world. It's about what's growing or produced from local farmers in our areas near our kitchens. So every single kitchen is very different. They all work with their own food systems and their own localities. And it's about building a community around food. Because, and we spoke this the other day, like, we all eat for very, very different reasons. And as people, we need to understand and I suppose use that as well to build these communities. Like, we can eat because we're happy, because we're sad. We could eat because of our religion, because we're on holidays. There's very different reasons to why we're sat around a table. But if we can build that table around communities, that's how we build our food system through our business. So it's very much about working with farmers for us, and not in a way that chefs, I give you an idea, like a chef is very much about, I want to make or produce a certain dish because I think it's going to look well, it's going to taste well, and my customers are going to like it. And for me, it's about taking that thought process and turning it on its head and going, well, hang on. It's not about what I want to cook or what I think will look well or will taste great. It's about what food and ingredients are available to me right now. And that really limits me, but in a good way, because it means that I can only produce food that's seasonal, that the farmer is telling me is ready, or for other reasons, we would buy food where the farmer has access or excess food that they can't sell to market, or because supermarkets might have cancelled it on them, even though they have crops ready to. So we intervene there and buy that food to make sure that the farmer gets an income and keeps them sustainable. And also then that we will then produce that food throughout those localities. So it's really about joining the dots and taking responsibility as chefs to go, it's more than just me. It's not about me as a person or a chef wanting to cook a certain dish. I need to understand how I can do it better. I need to understand my carbon footprint and how it can be more sustainable and step up to that responsibility.
That's great. I always think that constraints and limitations are how you can get creative, right? Like, having those constraints Absolutely. Is a really good place to start with that. And so, I think it's a little bit weird to talk about that sometimes, but like, we have an opportunity here, right? And so with that in mind, Dr. Kalibata, I'm curious, why exactly was the Food Systems Summit called the People Summit? What gave you hope from that summit? And where would you like to see more progress?
Thank you so much, Ali, for that question. I mean, the Food Systems Summit recognizes that we are behind on all 17 SDGs, recognizes that, in fact, like I said earlier, in some, we've been walking the wrong direction, especially on hunger, on poverty. We really are off track in a number of ways. But it also recognizes that the food, which Space is saying, brings us together in, unbelievable ways. It brings us together for different reasons. It's an opportunity, really, for mankind to rethink where we are going. It's such a journey too, all the way from production to the fork, like Rachel said. There's such a journey that has that we could rethink. We could rethink and really be able to correct a number of things that are going wrong. So part of why we came into the Food Systems Summit was to really have a conversation as a people and help people understand that we all have a place to play. We all have an opportunity to be part of the solution to the food challenge. I always tell people about the avocado story. In Europe, you get a size 22 avocado, and what you don't know, by the retailer defining that size 22 avocado, is that 90% of the avocados were left on the farm with all the water that was used to grow them. All that stuff remains on the farm, and that's why Rachel is saying we have more food than we need. We are actually wasting $1 trillion of food. So the summit was an opportunity for us to bring that conversation to people, to help people understand that we actually have a challenge in our midst. But it's also an opportunity for us to mobilize solutions. We have worked with a lot of action tracks, and we have mobilized 2,500 ideas, what we are calling game-changing ideas, that have been clustered in about 52 solutions. And these solutions provide an opportunity for people in the field to think about how they can deal with some of the challenges we have. For example, if you want a solution on sustainable livestock, there are institutions that provided an idea of what sustainable livestock looks like, and you can go and Google them, you can go and talk to them, their contacts and telephone numbers. And this is so important. When I became Minister of Agriculture in my country, I didn't know who to turn to. Just knowing that there's a whole lot of information out there that at a click of a button, you can go to these people and start discussing with them the different ideas and opportunities that are out there, whether it's on agroecology, whether it is on how organic farming, that these institutions are out there that can provide help. So the summit also that did provide that. But the most important part of the summit was the fact that countries for the first time are having conversation from a food system perspective, not an ending hunger perspective, not a dealing with nutrition perspective, not an environmental perspective, but a food system perspective, recognizing that the cost of inaction on food is costing us in terms of health, it's costing us in terms of poverty, it's costing us in terms of environment, it's costing us in terms of biodiversity. So all these things brought together really ensured that we had a summit that was giving us an opportunity to talk about the opportunities that we could harness from the food system, the mobilization that we could bring together as a people to be able to understand the ability we have to change our world, but also then really redefine for us what is at stake, as was said, as the IPCC recent report says. I mean, we just have to do something to fix our food system. So really the summit was an opportunity to bring all this to the fore. And even now as I talk, countries are still committing. We had over 155 countries, 12 hours was not enough. We had so many constituencies engaged. And for me, that's the biggest success. The fact that so many people understand what is at stake now and understand that they each have something to do about it.
Thank you so much for that. I always feel like climate change is this thing that allows people this lens through which people can understand just how interconnected everything actually is. This is really a realization that we actually need to come to at this point in time. And I'm curious, Dr. Besner-Kerr, you use the term by farmers for farmers. Can you explain that phrase and share a story about how communities are taking food solutions into their own hands?
Thanks so much, Ariel. And yes, I've been privileged to work alongside farmers mostly in Malawi. I did work in Tanzania for 5 years, but over the last 21 years, I've been working in Malawi, and farmers doing experiments themselves, testing different options themselves, and then sharing with other farmers. And these are really smallholder farmers, farmers with less than a hectare of land who are food insecure, who are facing deep poverty and tremendous other challenges. And that privilege has really given me insight into how much we can learn from them and how much they can teach others about solutions. And it's not just about food production, but Chef Spacey talked about building community, and I've raised this issue of inequity, and inequity is operating at the household level, gender inequity, deep gender inequity in many different parts of the world that leads and fosters child malnutrition and other difficulties, but also inequity of poor communities who don't have access to enough resources. And Dr. Kalibata made reference to this. I think listening to those marginalized voices has been what's so inspiring, seeing their ability to solve local problems, come up with solutions, and really improve their well-being and improve their lot with a small amount of support and encouragement from others. So I think this kind of participatory research and co-production of knowledge, learning from marginalized voices is a big part of the solution, as well as tackling these deep inequities at a global scale. And I think that's equally as important. I'd be remiss to not mention that the UN Food System Summit was initially criticized for maybe not bringing in enough of those marginalized voices and giving a little too much credit and time to some of these big companies for kind of calling the shots in our food system and not listening to marginalized voices enough. So I think a People Summit is really important and really deeply respecting, those who are facing food insecurity and recognizing their knowledge as being equally valid and important to learn from is something that I think is a really important part of the solution.
Thank you. Chef Spacey, one of the things that you mentioned earlier was that people eat for different reasons. And I think, you mentioned food being tied to things like religion and, personal palates and culture. And you also mentioned these cafes in Ireland. I'm wondering, from your perspective, how exactly do you reach people's minds in order to even begin to broach the way that, to even broach changing the way that people consume? And I want to be clear when I ask this question, because I think that sometimes it can be, I think that this is an important aspect of things. And also, I don't necessarily think that individual action is the most important thing that we need to do for climate change. I actually think that it's about politics. I think it's about industry. It's about companies. But there are things that people can do at home, right? And so how do you start to and you can also convince them to vote differently as well. So how do you start to change people's minds and to have them understand these issues?
It's a great question. And I think we put a lot of thought into how we get our message across to our consumers, and education is key. So we within our business, we spend a lot of time on our marketing campaigns around how we educate our consumers about the choices we as a company have made, and why, for instance, 5 years ago, we banned avocados totally, and they were cool and hip at the time, and every hipster wanted an avocado with their breakfast or brunch. And we stopped it and we banned them. But before we did a build-up marketing a month before we took them off and banned them completely, about why. So we spoke about why the avocado, it's not about the avocado itself, it's about the avocados that are coming to Ireland and where they're exported from, and the amount of water that's used to produce them, the amount of forest that is cut down to grow more, and so on. So we educate them around the climate impact, around the social impact, and then we explain why we're no longer using a product. That is one example. And then we show them an alternative. Like, for instance, in Ireland, we grow lots of greens around, like kales and spinaches and so on. So we say, forget your avocado, use this. This is why, this is the impact it's having. This is what you can use instead. And then we share recipes that they take home with them. We do demos online. So it's a lot more than just eating in one of our establishments. We try, when I spoke about communities, we're trying to build an awareness around what we do. Like I said, the last thing we did last year throughout COVID was we stopped all products of palm oil, and we explained why. It's not about the palm, it's not about the kernel itself. I mean, and in a lot of cultures, that's still a huge part of the culture, and they use it. And still today, it's not about that. It's about the palm oil that's produced in the products that we use here in this country, that are imported from the companies that we're talking about, and how that is controlled. So when we banned that, we explained again why, which also led into different huge corporations around chocolate. That led into how the cacao is harvested, and how even down to human trafficking and so on to harvest chocolate. So we're blowing people's minds, but we're connecting the dots as we feed them. And that's, I think, when you're sat around a table sharing food, it's also an opportunity to educate. And that's the vision, I suppose, that we take to that our consumers know, but also give them options. It's not about going, we don't use palm oil, full stop. It's about going, we don't, and this is why. And this is other alternatives. And this is what you as a consumer can look for when you go shopping or when you eat out elsewhere. So it's really connecting the dots so that our people that eat with us can go away feeling that they've learned something, had great food, you know, enjoyed themselves, but have taken something from the table as well. That to me is the key, education.
Yeah, I mean, some of our most important conversations happen around the dinner table, right? So that makes perfect sense to me. Okay, so we don't have that much time left. We have about 3 minutes. So I am curious, does anybody have any burning thoughts, closing thoughts that they would like to share, you know, on the idea of where do we go from here, right? We just had this great conversation. I feel like I've learned a lot. What's next?
Can I come in?
Yes, please.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'm a little bit concerned about some of the where I see us going, and I will qualify that. So while I admire your ability to drive local systems and local production, but there's a whole context here, understanding that avocado is supplied by a farmer who depends on you as a market is extremely important. So let's not forget that we also have a global system that we need to work through, and what we are doing impacts, you know, one thing I've learned through this Food System Summit is that what you do locally impacts many of us around the world. So I just want you to think about that. But also this whole idea of corporate versus small versus colonization versus whatever, I just find it unacceptable to be talking about Malawi as if Malawi is a global standard, a gold standard, when it is one of the poorest countries in the world, when farmers in Malawi can't feed their children, you know, and we need to face these facts. Let's tell people how using the systems that we are talking about, agroecology, how they can move them to feed their children. You know, let's not have people dumping fertilizers in their farms at 300 metric tons per hectare and Africans doing nothing and saying that's okay. Africans need to feed themselves too, and other parts of the world need to feed themselves too. So let's find a good balance in our world. Let's not talk about extremes of how we get to do business. I don't talk about colonialism because if I started, I would be hating people, and I don't want to hate. I want us to live in a world where we all, you know, can live with each other. So let's really try to understand that there's no gold standard. There's no one size fits all. Different people have to find in their environments ways to harness and move on and be able to live and have a decent living.
Thanks, Dr. Kalibata. I would agree there is no one size fits all. And I think that the example of Malawi that I gave is one where Malawians have improved their food security and nutrition in a very difficult circumstance. And so that's why I held it up as an example. And I think it's important to understand how we got here in order to look for solutions. But I agree entirely that there isn't one size fits all, and that we have a lot of solutions on the table, which are exciting and innovative. And I held up agroecology and marginalized voices because I really think that they are overlooked often and not listened to enough. But I appreciate the opportunity to share the table with you.
I definitely agree with you. These are issues we must continue pursuing, and really thank you for sharing your ideas.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. Dr. Kalibata, I just want to say that I really appreciate what you just said. And yeah, thank you for sharing those thoughts with us. Truly. All right. I believe that this is the end of this panel. Thank you again to Dr. Kalibata, to Dr. Besner-Kerr, to Chef Spacey for your time and expertise on this critical issue. For some closing thoughts, it's my pleasure to introduce Rajesh Mirchandani, the Chief Communications Officer at the United Nations Foundation.
Ariel, thanks so much. Thanks for doing a great job. And panelists, what a great conversation. What a great and timely conversation. I really appreciate your thoughts and your time today. For some of you, it is the end of a very, very busy high-level week at the UN General Assembly. So I really appreciate you taking the time out. Let's just remind ourselves of one of the reasons that we're here, and that is that up to 1/3 of emissions come from how we grow, produce, transport, and consume food. That's a huge amount. It's a problem, but it can be a solution as well. As Dr. Besnaker pointed out, it's not just about how the food is produced, but who holds the power. And it's also a timely conversation because of the Food Systems Summit that took place yesterday. And Dr. Kalabasa, I am so impressed that you still have the energy to join us and be so impassioned today after, I think, your 13-hour marathon yesterday at the Food Systems Summit. So thank you so much. And at that summit, billions of dollars was pledged, hundreds of countries committed to transforming their food systems, which is important, but it's not enough. It's a step in the right direction. Ariel, you mentioned that individual action is not only going to be enough, but of course, as we know, public opinion can and does influence policy. And certainly public opinion on climate and food, led in large part by young people taking to the streets, is helping shift the political debate and the policy landscape on this issue. And I hope we can carry on doing that in future. And as Chef Spacey, and kudos Chef Spacey for wearing your chef whites today as well. Chef Spacey, as you pointed out, the point about this work is about reconnecting people to food and to understand the problems before we understand how we can fix it. And you've shown with your restaurants how it can be done locally and sustainably. And if we really want to understand the solutions, then we need to understand the science and have a shared language of science. And that's what this event, and that's what our campaign, Say It With Science, is all about. It's the UN Foundation's campaign in support of the IPCC to connect the best climate scientists in the world to young people who, as I said, are right in the front of climate activism. We want to spread the IPCC's gold standard climate science far and wide using accessible statistics and shareable facts. You know, we want people to talk about climate change, and we want them to do so in an informed way, because it's only when we understand the facts of climate change that we can really work together to find the best solutions. So please do check out the sayitwithscience.org site, download and share some of those facts and infographics with your networks and talk about it more, because that's how we start, especially after today's enlightening and important conversation. Everyone, thank you so much for your wisdom, and everyone who's watching, thank you so much for joining us, and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you so much again, everybody, for attending this panel. Thank you to all the panel participants, really, and thank you to the United Nations Foundation for holding this Say It With Science panel. With that, I will sign off, but thanks again.